Alright, so now going to be moving on to Chartism, which is one of the main movements of the 19th century. We're not going to have a look at the ideology itself and the People's Charter in this lesson. We're just going to have a look at the Newport Rising of 1839, which is one of the three main Chartist disturbances of the period. Three main dates, remember: 1839, 1842, and 1848. So let's get into it. A brief overview. In this three-part series, we are going to discuss the three main events in the Chartist movement, as these events are most important with regards to your exams. This is because you can assess the value of each disturbance and how effectively the government dealt with it. So obviously there's a lot to talk about with regards to the Kensington Common fiasco of 1848 and the way the government dealt with that. But obviously we're going to get onto that in another lesson. So, we will go over the bare bones of Chartism, the People's Charter, and the leaders, such as Fergus O'Connor, in another lesson. Today is focused on the following three events. That says today, but we're going to be going over it in three separate lessons. Today's only the Newport Uprising, like I said before, 1839, but we will be going over the Plug Plot of 1842, and as I said before, the Kensington Common fiasco of 1848. So, was Monmouthshire a powder keg? The Newport Rising took place in Monmouthshire in 1839. The iron industry was well established in Monmouthshire, and coal industries were growing to support the iron industry. As a result, 95,000 out of 135,000 workers worked in the iron and coal industries, which meant that they were subject to poor living conditions and poor work conditions. And obviously there was a great population growth in this time due to rural migration in order to find work. So people moving from rural areas to the industrial areas, because obviously there's lots of jobs in the industrial areas from the factories. The truck shop system still operated in Monmouthshire, in spite of the fact that it had been made illegal via parliamentary statute in 1831. The truck shop system meant that employers paid workers in tokens that could only be spent at company shops, which would charge extortionate prices. I included a picture of one of these tokens to the right. As well as this, the tokens meant that the workers had no financial independence and operated in a similar manner to feudal serfs. The workers also resented the new Poor Law of 1834, which grouped parishes together and stipulated that they should spend their rates, so that's the money that the workers pay them, on the construction and maintenance of a workhouse, as opposed to traditional poor relief. And obviously the workers hated this because it was humiliating. They preferred the old system, where essentially the parishes would help the people on an individual basis. So like, say they were starving, the parish would provide them with food. Some of the causes for the rising. Monmouthshire had a tradition of protest, having been the location of a serious collier strike in 1822. Now, for those of you who do not know, a collier strike is essentially just a strike from the coal miners, and being in the centre of the black domain of the Scotch cattle. If you don't know, the Scotch cattle are very interesting. They're like a group of miners who would wear all leather, and they essentially formed their own small union. It's kind of like before trade unions were well established, and essentially when they would go on strike, they would punish anyone in an area who refused to go on the strike, or any union scabs who worked while the strike was going on, by going to their house and in the middle of the night wearing like leather clothes and painting their faces black, and they would essentially moo at the person in their house. Obviously that sounds quite silly, but that's not all they did. They would bring heavy metal chains and sometimes beat the scab close to death. And in one case, I believe the Scotch cattle murdered a worker's wife in retaliation. A grievance of the working class in Monmouthshire was the lack of political power they possessed, as they believed a parliament elected by the middle class would not represent their interests, a possible political cause for the rising. So in your exam, remember not to just say it's entirely due to economic factors such as the truck system forcing the workers to Chartism. You could argue that it was not economically driven, which is often referred to in exams as a knife and fork question, and you could instead argue that the working class participation in Chartism can be at least partially denoted to agreement with the movement on a political level. The leader of the South East Wales Chartists, John Frost, the ex-mayor of Newport, was chosen to be the Monmouthshire delegate to the Chartist National Convention after Frost set up the Chartist group in Newport in 1838. So obviously a year before the Newport Rising. Supposedly 20% of the local population had become Chartists, and therefore Chartism became the first mass political movement in the history of Wales. Government repression and the response. Henry Vincent was arrested in August 1839 due to the fact that he held a meeting in Newport in spite of the fact that a local magistrate had prohibited such meetings. Vincent had used language such as death to the aristocracy and called for workers to rise up against the authorities, and specifically he called for the overthrow of the government, of Parliament, and Queen Victoria herself. So obviously a lot of people weren't happy about that, especially the magistrates, who would likely have been the magistrates who would have been Tories, because the Conservatives weren't really a thing until 1846. So you can kind of see how Chartism overlaps with the birth of the Conservative and Liberal parties during Robert Peel's government. So obviously this disturbance, 1839, the last one in the period would be 1848, with the Kensington Common fiasco. So Vincent was imprisoned for a year in Monmouth. Now Chartists were banned from employment or holding meetings, and 3 Newport Chartists were also arrested. So obviously this is in retaliation to Vincent calling for the death to the aristocracy. It was a combination of these arrests, which would be political causes, and the rejection of the first Chartist petition, which infuriated the locals. But obviously you have to keep in mind it was partially inspired by economic discontent suffered by the workers. So, preparations for a rising. During November of 1839, Chartists planned a demonstration. When the first petition was rejected, a Chartist meeting was held at Blackwood on May 20th, where it was decided that secret cells should be formed and they should begin to accumulate weapons. During the final meetings of the National Convention on September 14th, it was determined that the Monmouthshire Chartists should march on Newport. They hoped that this would inspire a nationwide revolution. John Frost informed the Welsh Chartists of this plan on October 3rd. Then, on November 1st, the leaders made the final preparations for the rising at the Coach and Horses public house at Blackwood. On the weekend before the rising, a delegate from the National Convention warned Frost that the rest of Britain was not ready for the uprising yet, and that it should be postponed for 10 days, so that the rest of the country could prepare. Frost ignored this advice and proceeded with the rising as planned. And obviously we'll find out in a moment that was a very stupid idea on his part for the Chartists. Obviously it was a very good decision for the government. So the plan. The Chartists had attempted to assemble in 3 bodies. The leader in Blackwood would be John Frost. The leader in Ebbw Vale would be Josiah Williams, and the leader at Pontypool would be William Jones. These 3 groups would assemble separately and march to a rendezvous point at Risca, marching throughout the night. They would then march on Newport as a combined force on the morning of November 3rd or November 4th. So let's take a look at the rising itself. The plan did not work out as expected due to the fact that William Jones's column did not show up. This was because there had been a heavy storm on the night before the rising was planned, so many of his Chartists did not show up to the march, and they basically just went home. The authorities had also prepared for the rising. The Chartists attacked the Westgate Hotel, where 30 regular soldiers were stationed, and I've put a picture of that to the right. These soldiers opened fire on the mob, and 22 Chartists were killed, with several more being injured. And just from the top of my head, I believe that the soldiers stationed in Westgate Hotel came from the 45th Infantry Division. So this caused the mob to disperse in a panic. This was the largest number of people killed during an outbreak of civil unrest in the 19th century. Following the failed rising, Frost, Jones, and Williams were all arrested and sentenced to death. Their sentences were commuted to transportation for life, following civic unrest caused by the death sentence. And a interesting fact, the way that they were sentenced to death, these men were the last men to officially be sentenced to be hung, drawn, and quartered. And obviously I believe we discussed this when we were talking about the early 1800s, that Colonel Despard was actually the last man to be hung, drawn, and quartered. So these men would have taken that record, but obviously their sentences were commuted to transportation to Australia. Obviously, depending on your opinions, could be a fate worse than death if you don't like large insects. Hilarious. So that's it for the Newport Rising. Just from the top of my head, I would just like to point out that eventually the 3 men who were exiled, so the leaders of the 3 cells, were allowed to return to Britain, because obviously they had been exiled for life, so they had that commuted again. But 2 of them never showed up again. The only one who returned was John Frost. So that's just an interesting thing to consider. With regards to this, the main things that you need to note down would be that the Newport Rising was caused by a mixture of economic turmoil suffered by the workers as a result of stuff like the Poor Law of 1834, or the fact that their businesses that they worked for still operated under the truck system, which reduced their financial independence. And then So they're the economic factors, and then there are also political factors that drove it, such as the fact that Chartists had been discriminated and arrested in these areas, and a lot of the workers agreed with the Chartist movement in general. And in case you're asked how the government dealt with the main protests of the period, I would probably just note down that, again, the government suppressed it with the military, which is a common theme that you'll see runs throughout most of the outbreaks of violence during the period. So that's it for the Newport Rising.